Monuments fading into history often lose their context, disconnecting political configurations from their urban edifices. Robert Graves, in Claudia the God, depicts the dialogue between Claudius and Vitellius discussing the conversion of Ostia into a safe winter harbour. A republic can never hope to carry through public works on so grand a scale as a monarchy. All the grandest constructions in the world are the works of kings or queens, the walls, the hanging gardens of Babylon, the pyramids. Caesar, it makes one physically sick to think that they were built by human hands. And he compares it then to the Appian Way, built by a free people. The Roman road is the greatest monument ever raised to human liberty by a noble and generous people. It joins cities with city, nation with nation, and always thronged with grateful travelers. I think that Pharaoh might have been brought to the Hague for the human rights, but nevertheless the dialogue underscores the connections between the structure of governance and heritage and the values of the community. So really it is actually an idea of ideals. What sort of ideal? What city do we want? What city do we need? And then also, how can we achieve this city? It is then not just simply what we want, but how we want to achieve these possibilities. And we're going to look, therefore, at the opportunities of World Heritage and two aspects, and that is communities and the tools, which are the mechanisms. My first thing is to try and define then the communities. Let us consider the definitions of them. There's a need to give an all-embracing meaning to the term community, as most of the definitions of community focus on some form of identity, as most of the definitions of community include also space, time, and some other relationship. Within the World Heritage operational guidelines, I just checked through, and we have words like international community, local regional governments, local communities, general public, civil society, past, present, future generations. We have a whole multitude of definitions. And then we actually have to consider that in the future we will have virtual and diasporic communities, social medias, Facebook, WhatsApp, crowdsourcing chat groups and Twitter. They're not even mentioned in our operational guidelines. So in fact, what we really have to understand is not just simply to create a standardization, but very much to actually have harmonization. I think it is actually wonderful that we have so many different words to actually use it. But I would like to say that if we have so many activities and aspects of community, then we have to have some way of bringing it together. And I think that music gives us the most exciting way of dealing with it. In fact, the public are the percussion instruments. There's nothing more exciting and dramatic about the trumpet and the drums taking place. But we do not want them in the pianissimo. They affect then the music, but we do want them to be brought together from a cacophony to a symphony. So really, we're now at the point of exactly what's the issues, what's the problems that we're facing in urban heritage. So it is managing continuity, and I had the opportunity of sharing ideas with experts meeting yesterday, which was absolutely amazing. And in fact, we're looking at the management of change, perhaps, continuity, but it is dramatically different to look at Liverpool, which has halved its population before the war and after the war, or Shanghai, which in 20 years has doubled its population. The next part, which also we deal with, is the idea then of setting and context. And therefore the urbanism deals with old and new pressures on the urban landscape, losing this tradition and continuity. And we've then trying to face then volumes and shapes, iconic architecture, demolitions, new materials, and then we actually are dealing with the icons. So in fact, World Heritage, old and new icons. The heritage of today is the architecture of yesterday. The architecture of today is the heritage of tomorrow. In other words, there's no thing about the past, it is a continuum. So when we actually try to have in icons in World Heritage cities, or are they just simply the new icons of the future, or are we going to then say, well, the icon must remain that of the past? and that will depend very simply on a statement of significance of outstanding universal value. So let's look then at the mechanisms. The mechanisms are very important. We actually have to use them as pegs to hang our hats on. So when we hang our hat, we don't see the peg. So let's look at the milestones which has developed since 1972 of the World Heritage Convention. 1972 was not just simply the World Heritage Convention, but the Stockholm Conference. This was, in fact, a major change in the way we think about our cities. And I would like to just simply then focus on the period of 2000 to the present day, with the development of the historic urban landscape, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the new urban agenda. So what was the main change? It was monuments and sites. So we moved to monuments to include living cities. And then we didn't have the language to actually address these, because our language then deals essentially with how to deal with monuments and preserve monuments and not conserve urban heritage. And the most important part, obviously, we have representatives from Vienna, was the Vienna Memorandum. And the Vienna Memorandum was a seminal time in which we then started to develop then the idea we need a new language to deal with the layering of heritage. And therefore, the idea is very much not just simply the monument, the historic center or ensemble, but it includes a broader urban context and its geographic setting. And for most of us here, this is going to be an important point, which I would like to pick up in a minute. The next thing which happened after 2011 were preparations for the Sustainable Development Goals. UNESCO had prepared a statement and a document which had culture as an enabler or a driver for sustainable development. The approach is that it's not them or us, preservation or development, it is culture as an enabler for sustainable development. Not speculative development, that's not cultural anyway. And therefore, it becomes very critical for us to understand, therefore, the difference between a driver and an enabler. And we'll also look at that in a second. So if we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, which are now our marching orders in the world, and in fact that even at the local level, they become very critical, because this is where money from central government and international is actually going to be addressed, is Goal 11. That's making the cities inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. Well, that's as mayors, that's as professionals, what we have to do. It's a very, very motherhood statement, so I'm not too sure exactly what I have to do with it. But in fact, it is also linked to other development goals, 4, 8, 11, 16, and 17. 17 actually says to encourage and promote effective public, and civil society partnerships, building on the experience and resourcing strategies of partnerships. Now, this is, in other words, not just to look at the goal dealing with cities, but the goals which deal with civil society and other aspects which the cities give. Target 11.4 is then strengthen efforts to protect and safeguard the world's cultural and natural heritage. But that's not really correct, because it's not a goal, it's a target. The goal now reads, strengthen efforts to protect and safeguard the world's cultural and natural heritage to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. So we begin to see that our understanding of cultural heritage is a means and not an end. From the Sustainable Development Goals, we moved over to a particular part of urbanism, which was taken over by UN Habitat. And in this, there was the new urban agenda, and for this, UNESCO prepared the Global Report. I won't go into the details, but the Global Report spoke about people, environment, and policies, and actually then tried to focus on making it people-centered and understanding their environment, and try to address policies, which is the very heart of what the Organization of World Heritage Cities is doing. And so therefore the new urban agenda and HUL, which is the historic urban landscape, are our main mechanisms. In other words, if we want to be able to show how we are going to develop our ideas, we need to be able to harness things together in an integrative way. And this is going to be very critical because everybody has now to report. We have to report back what we're doing for Hull. We have to report back for Sustainable Development Goals. Central government will be asking city managers what they have done for particular things so as to be able to report. I call this reporting fatigue. And unless we start putting things together, we're not going to get much mileage. We'll be doing reporting and not doing any work. So my main proposal is then to try and link the new urban agenda with the historic urban landscape recommendation, and this is the transformative power of urbanization. Just to show you the difference between culture as an enabler or as a driver. If culture is a noun, it is a driver for development. Culture as an adjective is an enabler for development. I quickly scanned the new urban agenda, and cultural appears 15 times. Cultural interactions, cultural development, cultural diversity, cultural expressions. I won't go through the whole list. But you can see, therefore, that culture as an adjective, as an enabler for sustainable development is critical, and each city can then say, well, I've got from this smorgasbord, I can actually decide what are the particular issues of cultural which we can then bring for sustainable development. I've chosen 7 ideas which I would like to bring and share with you. I've brought them really mainly in my own personal experiences, and I'm sure that somebody else would come up with another group of 7, but let's just sort of look at the ideas which I'm presented over here. The first and most important one, which comes on the background of the historic urban landscape and new urban agenda, is an integrative city. Even in UNESCO, we have creative cities, we have then man and biosphere programs, there's also healthy city program, resilient city campaign, there's lots of different campaigns. Well, we have to then work out which are the ones which are most interesting for us. And when I considered the World Heritage Cities Organization, there are very few World Heritage cities. I think perhaps the Holy See and San Marino, I think Luxembourg perhaps, but most of us are really urban fragments. And I think that this is very important because we're not saying that we have heritage in the rest of the city. We're saying heritage as an enabler for sustainable development. We need to redefine the space that we have so as to be inclusive. And this integrative approach is not just geographic, but it's also then conceptual. The second part, and I would like to recognize my colleague Crystal Buckley from ICOMOS, who is championing the idea of linking culture and nature, is that the issue of urban protected areas. We have to then begin to see that nature is not just simply something, a piece of green on a plan, but it is something which is essential for the well-being of our lives. And well-being is one of the Sustainable Development Goals. And therefore it is exactly how, in fact, these spaces can be sponges within the city and the importance of seeing them in their relationship to culture. Culture without the natural background and the historic urban landscape looked at that, actually extended then the space. The third one is that of social transformations. I was at a meeting of the future of the European city in Berlin, and there must have been 400 people in the room, and I asked how many people are living in the city they were born in, and 4 people put up their hand. We're looking at a dramatic change about the responsibility and the relationships of people to place. And this transformations has been an issue, and we're now having to deal with it to understand that heritage does not just belong to people, but also to place. So the social transformations are creating a new agenda for us about how we relate to history, to our historical culture, and then also exactly how it is now being related to other agendas. My fourth point that I would like to look at is that of social inclusion. And we're speaking a lot about this, about equality, and about the importance of social inclusion. And we look around the world and we see the favela, the dumps, the townships, the banlieue, but that's also part of our cultural heritage. And I think that we can always, or because of Millionaire Slumdog, you can actually take a heritage walk around the Dawabi slum in Bombay. Not to say that we have to accept then the ideas of slums or bad housing, but that it is part of our heritage, and we cannot just simply put heritage in a particular gentrified area, as we're saying. So gentrification has been seen as a bad thing, but we have to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because I think that there is a lot of things of understanding the economic, socio-economic change is very critical for us to be able to then harness these aspects and these to create then conservation. Putting all this together is a term which was coined, strangely enough, at the beginning of the 20th century, called acculturation. It was very much within the social aspect, but I think that we're going to have to hijack this term and put it in for urbanism, the acculturation in the city. It's not just simply a syncretistic attitude about people, and it is very, very difficult to be able to accept acculturation. If you look at certain religious and certain ethnic groups, they will not then accept the fact of having acculturation. They would prefer to say, no, we are particular of what we do. And it's the difference between the salad bowl and the melting pot. The melting pot, you can't see the tomato because it's melted in the heat. The salad, it's made in the cold, we cut the tomato up, and we can still recognize it. So, in other words, what is the approach that we're trying to give for urban acculturation? We want to see Chinatown, even though that it might be in Manchester. The seventh and last one is that of the digital revolution. We haven't even touched the tip of the iceberg in relating to it. And it's not the smart city of the infrastructure, it's the smart of our own ways of life and how this can change our lives, and we have to then see how this is going to harness all these changes. And all this is based on values. And we all know that the Borough Charter has actually given us a fact that places might have a range of values for different individuals, and values are continually renegotiated. Well, that really cuts at the OUV. Therefore, there cannot be OUV if we have then always renegotiating. We have to give this a separate thought, and it's not the subject of my speech now. But it's not the values that people have got problems with, it's their interpretation. The Sunni and Shiites are more at heads than perhaps Islam and Christianity, with the Orthodox and the Protestants, or the Haredi and the Reform. So we've got then the interpretation of values is more critical. Whether we are existentialistic or we are there historicist is really critical. And I then urge you to be more existentialistic in the approach of interpretation. I would like to quote Hannah Arendt, who wrote about the origins of totalitarianism after the Second World War. And she wrote, "The cultural treasures of the past, believed to be dead, are being made to speak, in the course of which it turns out they propose things altogether different than what had been thought." And I think this is something which is we should be very much aware of. And this brings us to the importance, therefore, of cultural diversity and heritage diversity. And in the Nara document, we actually have that it exists in time and space, demanding respect for other cultures. And this is where it is extremely difficult to actually manage. So what we're saying that we have multiple stakeholders, but the multiple stakeholders are ourselves. We have multiple identities. Amartya Sen, in his wonderful little book, Quite Naive, speaks about identity and violence. And the more identities we have, the less violent we will come. So India and Pakistan might be at the edge of a nuclear war, but they play cricket together. So I think that the idea, therefore, of extending multiple definitions through ourselves and not just through groups is a way, therefore, of involving legitimate stakeholders. And we should be looking also at cold spots, the whole idea of then youth and those communities with little or no voice And this is a responsibility which we have. So my last part is then just to deal with the involvement of culture and the culture of involvement. And therefore, it is sharing the data for citizens, the role of the OWHC, and this is in fact the role of the mayors, the city. They are the honest brokers in trying to actually listen to what is happening around the various stakeholders and what is then coming together. They have to accept that we have shipwrecks of time, as Francis Bacon has called it. We have scars of history and we have sites of conscience. It is really the promoting the understanding of this shared heritage that we have to then try to achieve. So the future issues are essentially social inclusion, the digital age, and ideas of resilience. And I would put this forward as that to understand exactly the next parts of our day's discussions. It is also the minimum necessary and the maximum possible. And I'd like to speak about the idea, therefore, of space. So we have in most cultures, so we have ma in the Japan. The whole idea is that you don't relate immediately to something which is happening. There is a hiatus. We reflect, we don't answer somebody immediately back. We have Wu Wei, which is in the Chinese. We have also in the Kabbalah, we have then the understanding of the Ein Sof, the infinity, that God in the infinity then contracts and then creates a space for the other to actually enter. So I would like to just simply end with the reflecting on three terms, because we're in Asia and the Pacific. And the three terms I'd like to look at is Machinami. The Machinami is a wonderful internal Japanese ICOMOS convention, which is essentially translates as historic town. It includes the nuance of the historic core, but is also specially dealing with people. The second one is that of China, and that is Shanshui. And the Shanshui, if we understand, therefore, how do we translate the word landscape, it is actually not really important. It's how do we then say Shanshui in English rather than landscape in Chinese. And the aim of the traditional Chinese artist is to capture not only the outer appearance of a subject, but its inner essence as well, its energy, life force, and spirit. So I've got a proposal that we are going to call this now the Historic Urban Shanshui. And I think that this would be a better way of reflecting than the ideas of spirit of place and being more international as opposed to taking on one part of our approach to the landscape. And of course, being here in Ganzhou, that we have to understand, therefore, this is Haiko, but I actually checked out that H is more important than the Aiko, and it's Huabaik. And it was the Council of Nobles that made it as a rule that consensus may be reached only with a unanimous agreement. I wish this on our deliberations. Thank you.